Welcome to Apologia Live, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians, live here from Apologia Studios in rugged Nova Scotia, Canada. And today I'm very excited to not just be addressing the claims of Christians, but to actually have that said Christian be with me. I'm super excited for tonight's conversation that I'm going to have with Dr. Stephen Boyce. Stephen, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, good discussion is ahead of us, I'm sure. Looking forward to the material.
For a bit of background, I created a Who Really Wrote the Gospels video late last year, I think around December or so, and Stephen was on a couple of panels addressing that and another video that I did with Camille, both around the gospel authorship. I then decided last month to do a response to that 6 hours of panel streaming that Stephen was on. Now, Stephen was not responsible for it being 6 hours. He was with many other people, all of whom wanted to say things, so it's not his fault.
No.
And then I believe it was a week ago, last Monday, Stephen was on with Inspiring Philosophy, our good friend Michael Jones, responding once again. And so we've decided, let's just have it out.
Sure.
But that's
yeah, why not?
Exactly. No, we're not having it out. We're going to try and find common ground and elucidate both Christian and non-believer alike tonight with our discussion. I have many questions and just many thoughts. But before we get to that, Stephen, briefly tell our audience who you are and what they need to know about you leading into this discussion.
Sure. My name's Stephen Boyce. I am a Anglican. I'm a Christian in the Anglican tradition. And particularly the only thing that's really significant about me is I run a podcast called Facts, which is an acronym for Fathers, Apocrypha, Canon, Text, and Scripture. Typically, we do anything related to that. I have a co-host named Tyler West, and then we have special guests come on, and then I do individual episodes. But it's pretty much related to anything church history or the Gospels or the Apocrypha or anything in the Old Testament related to canon or in textual criticism. So those are most topics that I deal with on a regular basis. And then I get invited on like IP or Testify to sometimes share insight. And so that's mostly what I do is just have these kind of discussions. And honestly, I have a blast doing it. I think they're fun. I think it's fun to interact with people who have different opinion. And I enjoy it. It's really a lot of fun for me.
Well, you're now on the Apologia Response Heretic Squad. Heretic Squad. You're not the heretic. I'm the Heretic Squad. So we're here to talk today about gospel authorship in general. And I wanted to do kind of two things before we start really clashing. And the first is to find the point where I think we are in most common agreement, and we'll talk about that. And then I want to talk about the thing where I think we're furthest apart.
Okay.
And then we can spend most of the time in the slushy middle. If anyone wants to send super chats or have questions that way, we will take those kind of toward the end of the discussion so that we don't interrupt the flow. But feel free to send those in, and we will definitely get those curated and collated and handle those as they come in. So the first thing that I think that we have most in common, and I base this based on your last stream with Inspiring Philosophy, and that is that we both have frustrations with the evangelical churches or certain people in evangelicals who take a overly simplistic view of certain things. I think that we have that in common.
Yep.
And in fact, go ahead.
No, yeah, you're right. I've been a harsh critic of a lot of what I call the big E evangelicals. So one of the things that the problem in a lot of Christianity, especially here in the US, they are very simplistic, not just on the subject, they're simplistic on everything. It's just, well, the Bible says it, I believe it, let's just carry on mentality. And I don't think that's the way the ancient church practiced their faith. I think it was a little bit more in depth than that. I think that there was a lot more going on. I think everything's too simplistic in evangelicalism as a whole. It's one of the reasons I left the evangelical movement and moved into Anglicanism, which is more ancient practice of Christianity. And so, yeah, I've been very dissatisfied, and I've been very vocal. I've done entire episodes called Out with the New and In with the Old and things like that. It's like, let's get rid of this modern idea of Christianity that's here and developed in the United States and Western world. let's bring in a more ancient viewpoint of our Christian faith, and let's try to seek to practice Christianity the way it was intended to be practiced from the beginning. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to modern evangelical views of things, I find most of their explanations of Christianity to be way too simple, way too simple.
And so when I make a video like the one that I made that you first responded to was who really wrote the Gospels, the animated painterly one without my cartoon face on it at all. That when I make a video like that, I'm largely presenting facts that I'm assuming are brand new to the person listening, because that is the type of Christian audience I have are typically evangelicals. And so they are getting that information from me for the first time. A lot of that information. I know nothing in that video surprised you or probably anyone on that panel. But perhaps you think that's a bit of a problem. And if an evangelical is hearing it first from an atheist who may have a different framing than you would have, do you think that was part of a disconnect on how you were, well, not just going to how you're responding, because you obviously should be responding to the ideas and to the context and all that, but I assume that lends a little bit of context for you about where I'm coming from.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it helps knowing that on this side. And I think Michael actually brought that up in the last discussion, that your target audience or perspective was probably more this kind of Christianity. And I can understand that. And so we actually have a common criticism on that side of things, because I really do think that when you start challenging, there's goods and bads of you doing this, I guess, for Christians. The good is you're going to make Christians think outside the box. And the "my pastor said" argument is going to be explicitly exposed, I should say. And so I think it's good that Christians get challenged, because we've boxed them in too much in Christianity, where it's like, oh, no, let's protect them from this information. Let's protect them. It's like, that's not possible in our world anymore. And I've been a huge critic of that, because you can't hide. One, you've got these right here, and children can use them better than adults. So you're not going to hide your children from what's out there in the world. You're not going to hide them from the data. They're going to find it. They're going to research it. And so it's going to do one of two things. It's either going to push them to dig deeper into their faith and understand where they came from and why they believe what they believe, or it's going to shake them to the point where they're crippled and they can't do anything, and then they're just going to chuck everything out the window. And I've seen both. I know both exist, because I was challenged on this, and I grew up in a fundamentalist background. So independent Baptist, very conservative. My family, my mom and dad weren't like this, but the churches I was in and a lot of the background I was in was like this. Women were treated as second-class Christians. I mean, it was a whole simplified Christianity that was based on a certain era of Christianity of success during the time of like the Billy Graham Crusades and the Great Revivals, and
right.
And all the professors and preachers were still living on some great big event that happened back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so, you're living in the pastime Christianity, the old paths Christianity, which really isn't that old. It's like 60 years. And so that became like the essence of what you're taught. You're taught everything through that lens. And the first time I was actually challenged outside of the lens that I was raised in, it shook me to the core. And I remember telling stories about this too, like the authorship of 2 Peter, for example, when I was first challenged in it, and I actually started doing my investigation, I was not very happy with what I was finding for answers. And I remember, sitting in, on the side of my bed in the middle of the night, grabbing a copy of scripture that I had there, opening it in 2 Peter. And I remember weeping, like just holding my Bible, weeping, because I was shattered. And it took me almost 2 years to actually study it very, to look at it from a whole new world of angles, to take the critics in mind and keep their comments. Say, okay, well, this part of it is accurate, and this part of their criticism is accurate. And then there were Christians that were outside of the realm of Christianity that I was raised in that actually gave plausible insight that I didn't think of before, like Richard Bauckham, for example. And so I started accumulating concepts from Christians, skeptics, atheists that had ideas about Second Peter to formulate an idea and an identity that I had with the book, But it shattered me to listen to somebody like yourself, and I'm not saying it was you, but somebody like yourself who actually put it out there, and it crippled me for a long time. I wouldn't touch, preach, read, or anything out of the book of Second Peter for the longest time. And so, but it was good for me. I look back and say, that was the best thing that could have ever happened to me, is to be challenged beyond what I was taught. And the same is true of the Gospels. I've had to think outside of what I was taught. And even in scholarship that agrees with the authorship that I lean with, I would formulate an argument very differently and start at different points than they would, skip points that they would. Sometimes we land at the same place, but we didn't take the same journey to get there.
Well, that's actually one of the reasons I even did the response videos that I did, was because I found myself nodding along with you so often in the responses to me that I was like, I literally wanted my audience to hear from a Christian some of the things you were saying. So I'm excited. And along the lines of, just while we're on the subpoint of just some points of agreement, let's talk about the Gospels a little bit.
Sure.
Let's talk about Matthew and John first, because I think that's where we have the most agreement. And we'll get to, most of this will be disagreement, so we'll get to the points of agreement. Neither of us believe that a single member of the 12 wrote from top to bottom the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of John, or even dictated to a scribe. I don't think that either of us think that simplistic view of Matthew or John would hold water. Is that reasonable to say?
I would say John was involved in the Gospel of John as a narrator.
So you think John dictated top to bottom?
Not top to bottom. I think it was a group project. I call it the Johannine community, which would have involved him. So, in the writings, for example, of the Muratorian fragment, we have a statement that Andrew, and it doesn't list any other names. It says that Andrew and other disciples were with John, and they wanted him to narrate the gospel in his own name as they brought them back to remembrance, which was interesting. And I think a lot of people skip over that part of the Muratorian fragment, where in John's gospel specifically, it didn't say as he remembered them. It says as they remembered it, being that there's a group there. And to me, we see evidence of this throughout the gospel. We see one of the few gospels actually uses the pronoun in the plural, like we have seen, or even in the narration of his epistle in First John chapter 1, you have the same thing. That which we have seen, which we have touched, we have heard, the word of life. And then in chapter 1 of the prologue, you have the we there. We beheld his glory. And then at the very end, you can actually see at the very end of the Gospel of John where the narrator stops, the penman stops, and the community backs both, because it actually, the rumor got started in the churches that Jesus said that John would never die, or the disciple who was leaned up, who we assume to be John, and he interjects himself and says, I know this wasn't true because I'm him. And that's not what he meant. What he meant was, if you wanted me to live this, and he didn't use those exact words, I'm obviously paraphrasing, but then the audience that seems to be with him pulls back and says, and we know his testimony is true. It's almost like the background audience came in to defend the narrator's alleged statement. Like what he's saying is true. We were there too, or we know this to be true because we have had this understanding. And so you can even see in John's gospel where he pauses at times. Another place is at the cross when Jesus is allegedly seen as dead. At that point, the guards come and stick a spear right into his side, comes water and blood. And John is the only one that reports that, because he would have been the only one at the cross based on the narration holding the mother. And in that, he says, he pauses after saying blood and water came out. He said, and I am testifying these things. I've seen these things so that you would believe. So he pulls himself out of narration mode. Somebody jumps in and says, this is being written for you so that you would believe it. Does the same thing in chapter number 20. These things were written so that you would believe. And there's many more things we could have said. So there's no doubt in my mind that when you read like the Muratorian fragment, and there's other statements that like the friends of John were with him when dealing with the authorship of John in the early writings of the fathers, they seem to believe that there was more people in there. Another reason behind that internally is none of these other apostles, for example, were given any kind of speaking lines the way they are in Mark or in Luke or in Matthew. You see at the very beginning of John, Andrew is highlighted over his brother. I always found that odd because when
Right.
you go to Mark chapter 1, it's Peter and his brother Andrew. And then in John, you have Andrew and his brother Peter. The order is reversed, and the emphasis is there as well. And that Andrew goes and finds Simon Peter, brings him to Jesus after saying, "We found the Messiah." Jesus looks at Peter and says, says, "Simon, your name is now Petros. You're going to be rock, Cephas. You're going to be," uses the Aramaic and the Greek interpretation there. I find that interesting because Peter doesn't say a single word in that entire correspondence with Jesus. Andrew gets a speaking line. Jesus speaks. Peter's there,
Right.
but he doesn't say a single word. And the emphasis is on that. And so I think that's actually consistent with the Muratorian fragment. If Andrew is involved, his speaking line makes sense in chapter 1 that he actually gets a interjection before Peter, because I think Peter's dead by this point, long dead. And then you find Philip getting a speaking line. Thomas gets a speaking line. Judas, not Iscariot, gets a speaking line. Nathaniel gets a speaking line. You don't see that in the synoptics. So it seems to reason that there is actually, whether it's all of those individuals or not, I doubt it, but you do see a group involvement. You get multiple viewpoints of the apostles getting a statement or an experience with Jesus that you don't find in the synoptics, because they're almost always based off of Peter's direction, decisions, or statements.
Okay, awesome. For my audience, I'm not pushing back at all at this point, because at this point, I'm nodding along in agreement that these are evidence. I would say, I'm with the observations. I'm agreeing that these are definitely markers that it wasn't the work of a single person in solitary just doing it on their own, which is
Yeah,
kind of what I was, which is what I was taught as an evangelical, even to the extent,
Me too.
oh yeah, definitely John definitely would have had enough time to learn Greek because he lived to a long age, so he wouldn't have even had help of a scribe. Like, I was just, that far along on the single thing. And Matthew, I don't want to get into the details quite yet, but it's my understanding that you feel like Matthew is also for the Church of Jerusalem group project in a similar fashion. Mark is potentially, I think you and I would disagree most on Mark. I think you think that quite plausibly Mark did this very much on his own based on recollections of what Peter said, even though I believe you think that Peter probably had input from other people so that he could narrate events that he wasn't at. So
Sure.
he had other sources. And then Luke, I think we both agree, Luke Acts has just a ton of sources. Whoever edited, it doesn't matter if it's Luke or whoever, that this is a person who had
Absolutely
many notes from many different places that he was largely an editor, probably, of. So that's sort of, I think, places where we're going to start from that we agree. And then I think where we most disagree is going to be not actually about the apostles, but is about epistemology and how we look at this. Now, when you had described, you had a kind of bit of a crisis of faith when you learned about Second Timothy authorship. Second Timothy authorship Second Peter authorship. Pardon me.
Second Peter.
Second Peter authorship, similarly for me, was tricky. Although Timothy's, same thing. For me, I had to take my Christianity down to a point where I said, you know what? I've lived my whole life accepting this on authority. Just my Bible school teachers, my pastors, everybody. I just accepted their authority, didn't bother looking into it on my own because it seemed like they knew what they were talking about. So when I had my crisis of faith, I came at it and said, okay, what can I'm not going to assume any of it's true. I'm going to assume nothing.
Okay.
And frankly, in terms of principle of charity, I'm probably not even giving it principle of charity. I was like, what can I build back, assuming nothing? Whereas it feels like your effort. If I haven't heard a lot from you, but if I'm understanding correctly, you try to work your best to take all the church traditions and everything the fathers wrote and all the evidence and give good plausible reasons to accept, to save as much of that tradition and accept as much of it, to say yes to as much of it as you think you can. Is that fair?
I think it's fair. I want to start with, so this is the approach I take. This is the exact approach I take. What is the alleged statement? Not modern, like historically. Let's start with the earliest date of statement, whether we're talking about Papias or whether we're talking about Irenaeus or whether we're talking about Clement or whoever. What are these statements being made here? And if we have the lineup of statements, how many, we put them up, we look at the timeline, connection, significance. Where do they agree? Where do they disagree? So, I call it the unbroken chain of custody. So if you're looking for a legal case here, we're trying to put together the alleged statement. So take the Gospel of Mark. Papias is telling us that Peter was behind it, dictating to Mark. We find that in any other place that we go to find, all right, who says what about the authorship of Mark? I don't know of any other alleged statement early that is different than Peter's behind it. And most would even go, but so you look at, is there another name other than Peter being attached to Mark? No. So we have a consistency there. And so when you take that part over here, then you look at stage 2 here. Do we have a different location of where it is being done or how it was being done? Was Mark free to just scribe this, or was he under strict dictation from Peter? Because there is actually some room for disagreement about how Mark did it. Some would say that he went off of what he remembered Peter preaching. Some would say that Peter actually dictated to Mark what to write. Some would so far as say Peter didn't want to do it. So, I mean, but that he was actually involved in the scenario. And so when I look at those things, I start with, okay, so they're saying Peter's behind it. So externally, the evidence is overwhelming in the patristics and the fathers that Peter is behind this gospel. So what do we look at internally? So if Peter's behind this gospel, we have to actually see evidence of that, not just by claim, but by actual, the document must reveal. And one of the things that I unpack in the Gospel of Mark per se is that the whole gospel is traditionally based on his viewpoint. Things that happen are based on him understanding. Like the whole narration ends and finishes, or begins and finishes on his understanding of Jesus' statement, or he just completely blows it and misunderstands Jesus' statement. And everything is based on his mindset. And then you even have the inclusio eyewitness perspective where he is first mentioned, and then he is also the last one mentioned. Tell my disciples and Peter, making sure the book ends with Peter, starts with Peter. You have his mindset, his thoughts, his intentions being unraveled in the text where it says, Peter remembered these things, or Peter thought to himself. You don't see that in the other gospels, but you do highlight it all through the Gospel of Mark, where it is solely based around his understanding, except for in places like, I guess you'd listen to the podcast I did recently on events that he wasn't there.
Places. Yeah.
But even that bears the evidence of what I'm saying, because when he's not there, the details of the narration go to just matter-of-fact statements. This person was here, this was said, this was done, and then it just very much moves on. When Peter's there, he actually, you find Peter giving great details, like location, where he was standing, or people that were around, things that were happening, sounds, things that were seen, and perceptions. Those are now heightened and detailed when Peter's actually there versus when he's not there. And so then you look at things like, okay, so if Mark is writing something for Peter, will we see oral tradition make itself into the written text here, where Mark is actually faithfully following Peter, even if it's bad literature? And I would say, yes, I'd actually say the Gospel of Mark is not the best written as it relates to, say, compared to Luke. I think Luke is far more. And we see so many run-on sentences. I mean, there's sections in the Gospel of Mark for almost 4 chapters where there is no antecedent for the pronoun noun connection, where Jesus is speaking and it just goes on he, him, his, he, him, his. And our English translations actually go in and put Jesus in place of the pronouns.
Right.
So, and so to me, it's like, is it possible that this is a large sermon section for Peter where Mark is continuing? I mean, I do that. I mean, when I teach or something, I don't have to clarify my nouns all the time.
I'm going to get to some of that, but I just want to, before we get too far down that road, because I see myself losing my thread here.
No, don't do that.
But do we agree? Do we agree that epistemologically, like I think you're demonstrating there, you are looking to affirm all kinds of stuff?
Yes,
whereas you're bringing in all that stuff and kind of saying, oh, this works if we think about looking at it this way and works it this way. Are you at all sympathetic to a view like mine, where it is like, I lost him. I lost Stephen. Hopefully he comes back. Meanwhile, we have a super chat. Thank you for Myth Vision Podcast, our good friends at Myth Vision Podcast. Would Stephen still be I can't answer this. Would Stephen still be a Christian if he didn't believe the miracle stories about Jesus ever happened as recorded? Resurrection, virgin birth, etc. We will come back to that. You're not having much podcast luck these days.
I'm telling you. Am I back?
Welcome back. You're back. Welcome.
I don't know what happened. I don't know what's going on these days, man. All right. Sorry. All I heard was
it's bugaboos.
And then it all cut.
I guess I was asking if you're at all sympathetic to a view like mine, where I am like, show me. I'm not going to take that at its face value. So things like Papias' description of Matthew and Mark, to me, sure don't sound like the Matthew and Mark that we have in our hands right now. I'm fully open to that there was a proto Matthew. Absolutely, that maybe that's what Papias had, but then people are insisting that proto Matthew, no, it has to be what we have now. I'm like, why? Like, why does it have to be? It just doesn't have to be. So I look at things like, so I'm looking at this not as, well, the earliest ones said that it was, so hey, that's the earliest tradition. I'm like, when is the earliest? Well, it sure doesn't seem very early to me. And I know you've got reasons for maybe why they weren't doing that, but that doesn't change the fact that they weren't actively using the names in extant documents now. So the best I can do is like, well, hey, in the 180s seems like the earliest this is nailed down. Are you at all sympathetic to where I'm coming from at all?
And honestly, I am. I'm sympathetic to a certain point, I guess. When we look at this, I wish it was so much easier to just. It'd be a whole lot easier if there was just a very blanket, quick, written statement straight from John that made it through, straight from Matthew or Peter that just survived antiquity. This would be a lot simpler. I agree. So I am sympathetic to the fact that we're only getting bits and pieces that are spread out. And a lot of what I've tried to do on my end is corroborate the evidence to see if we can actually come up with a viable explanation for how these things came to be, instead of accepting just anything, but throwing away everything. And I'm not saying you or anybody else is doing that.
No,
I'm just saying,
I'm
just saying that, well, I am saying that happens all the time, but it's, instead of saying that, and this is the response, well, Papias was just dumb and we shouldn't trust him mentality. It's like, okay, Eusebius criticized him on his eschatology. We got that. Okay. With that being said, he also used Papias to corroborate the Gospel of Mark with Clement of Alexandria. So he obviously didn't think he was discredited to the point where he wasn't worthy of using. When he didn't like Papias, he didn't use him. When he thought Papias was saying something of value and he saw other historical figures saying similar things in tradition, he put the traditions together and said, this works. I'll give you another example. Like if we just go off Irenaeus for certain things, he states that Jesus was 50 years old. We don't have that tradition anywhere else ever. In fact, most say that he was in his 30s, early 30s. And so Irenaeus says it. He's not an idiot, so he got it from somewhere. But just because Irenaeus says it doesn't mean it's right, because it can't be corroborated with anybody else. Therefore, in that scenario where Irenaeus makes claim of Jesus' age, I would say, it's probably wrong. He made a mistake. And so what I don't do is what I've heard, and I've heard this, I've had it said to me on programs. If Irenaeus can't even get the age of Jesus right, why should I listen to what he has to say about Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John? And see, that's throwing out the baby with the bathwater. It's like, so I don't expect these guys to be perfect, and I expect them to be wrong about information. And what I try to do is put everything they're saying and find out how much of that elsewhere I can actually figure they're in agreement across the board here. So for example, Mark and Peter, all of them are saying it came from Peter originally. How that happened is not clear. So that's where you got to dig deep and try to bring up every possible explanation from within the text, other statements about the text, fragments that we find in the manuscript traditions, variants in the traditions. That's where you have to bring in a cumulative amount of evidence to start figuring out how, where, when, why, more so than the who, because they're all saying the who, and they're all in agreement on that. So where they disagree is really where the debate and the discussion, I think, has to be had. But I am sympathetic to those who say this is a lot of work. Why can't this just be a lot simpler? And I echo that and say, boy, it'd make my job easier too. But I don't ever want to be on either extreme where it's like, it's all or nothing. Let's just throw it out or something like that. I don't want to be that guy.
That's good. I think we both want to be in the middle for sure. Is it fair to say that you would want someone like me to disprove traditional authorship given the unanimity of sources? That you were saying, hey, I'm going to take at face value, everyone agreed that we have written, so the burden is on me to disprove that. Where I am saying I need the burden of proof, like prove to me that this is who wrote them. Is it fair to say that we're both putting the burden of proof in the opposite person's camp? Do you think
I would agree with that? I would agree with that.
Cool. All right. So that's, I think, probably the place we most disagree, because, I don't know if you'd agree that that's where we most disagree, but that's where I think we're going to leave it. And now we're going to move on to some of the other topics. I had a rough outline, and I'm going to jump around a little bit. But one of them you talked about was chain of custody, or, chain of evidence and that kind of thing. Now, as someone who sees the Gospels, from my perspective, all I can see is legendary development and legends growing. I imagine oral traditions growing through evangelical evolution. The stories that win converts are the ones that get repeated. When there's problems or pushbacks, then polemics get created to push all that. That's what I know. That's not probably what you see, but that is so clearly what I see, that when I get to hundreds of years later, all I can imagine is, why would this not continue in the church? That people keep, well-meaning people, not lying, not saying things they don't believe, but, accepting growing legendary stories. When I view the Gospels and the church fathers as that progression, when I hear someone tell me that, First Clement had a tradition with Mark, or I know you don't think that he knew Mark, but that, he was, because he was at his church, they shared a
tradition. About Clement of Alexandria?
Clement of Alexandria, for example.
Yeah, okay. Sure.
Or people want to say, certain church fathers knew John, or that all those connections where it's like, well, no, that church father didn't specifically say that they did. What we have is a tradition 100 years later connecting those people together. Unless I'm seeing that, I guess I'm wondering why, and I'm blanking. Is it Irenaeus?
Irenaeus.
Irenaeus that was allegedly connected to John.
Yes. So it was John Polycarp Irenaeus. Yes,
Thank you. Polycarp. Why? And people called me Polycarp in Bible school. Why did I blank on that?
Really?
Yeah, they thought it was funny because I hated it. I didn't like being called Paulie. And so when we were in church history class and suddenly there's this guy named Paulie Carp, then that just was hilarious.
So I knew the Pokemon before I knew the church father.
Oh, funny.
So it was always funny to me that there was a Polycarp that was a church father. I was like, wait, isn't that a Pokemon or something? But yeah, so
Polycarp, for example, in his writings, I know we don't have much, but he never makes that claim, right? He doesn't claim to know John. That claim is put on him by other people later. Correct?
Correct. Yeah, by his own individual accounts. He doesn't. What very, very little we have. Yes.
So does it make sense that someone like me is saying, man, it sure looks like this isn't a growing legend. Like if he knew John, that seems like something he would say. And it seems like someone's coming along later trying to bolster those credentials even more by adding that on, either knowingly or that's just the story that went around.
Sure.
Does it make sense that that's a trajectory that someone like I am seeing?
Yeah. So I think that's fair. I think that's fair in that regard. And so that so my approach is similar there too. You may not believe that, but it is. There's a lot of legends about John. Eusebius actually reports quite a few legends that were related to John. There's one where he had a student who was wayward, and his student ended up becoming a tribal leader. His student ended up becoming somebody that was leading a gang of robbers. I mean, they were jumping people that were in travel from cliffs and stuff. John chased this guy down, sat down with him, pleaded with him, cried with him, and his love for that young man led the young man to repentance. I mean, we have this legend about John. The problem is that the statement about John, the question is, could it be true? Could something like that have happened? Sure. But that tradition is late, and Eusebius receives it and he's just letting you know, I have this record about John. Whereas in a situation, say like Irenaeus is framed by the man who knew John. And if that were true, what did Irenaeus convey about it? Like, I've never met my great grandfather on my dad's side, but I've had multiple conversations about who he was, his contribution in World War I and World War II, and things like that, because my grandfather has told me about my great grandfather. And though he's years before me, I still have statements and stories about that because I'm connected. And so Irenaeus speaks of a lesson that he learned. And he even says that he can go back to the exact place where Polycarp was teaching, he and another young man, about their time with John. And then we have statements, and I don't know, there might be some questions on the lost writings of Irenaeus, but even his time and his encounter with Polycarp and John being in Ephesus together, running into Cerinthus, who started kind of an early formation of Gnosticism. So Irenaeus is actually giving credibility to the man that trained me, told us stories about his time with John. So no, Polycarp doesn't, and we have so much that we don't have anymore too from Polycarp.
Understood.
And so it's like, what's the next best thing, right? What's a legend that comes down 200 years later, or a guy who is directly connected in line with John? Well, Polycarp doesn't say anything about John, but he did have a disciple who did say Polycarp spent time with John in his early years, and he learned about it, and he remembers storytelling about it, similar to how
but that's
my great grandfather.
And that has like the bathhouse story, right, about John, where
right? Well, there's that one. There's that one. There's two. So he tells two stories about Polycarp and his connection to John. And that bathhouse is one of them. Yeah,
right.
Definitely.
But you can, so someone like me reads these. It's like, okay, well, he was listening to, I accept that John was a real person and that he was teaching up until his age, and that they're probably, what might he have, sat at his feet one time as a young lad, as he said, does that mean that he's in that real tradition and that I should lend any extra credibility to what he says, a couple generations down the line? Can you see why for someone like me that is not anything to build anything on?
Sure. And so just to be clear, if all Irenaeus is saying is that, and he's the only one that would say that, that goes back to Irenaeus making the statement Jesus was 50, right? So
Right.
do we base our entire premise on that? If that's all we had, then yeah, we're screwed. Because that's just one delegated statement by himself
Understood.
about it. So,
But it's a category. For me, it's a category of evidence. Church, like tradition is, and tell me where I'm wrong. Like, to me, just tradition is a whole category of evidence that means so little to me. And maybe it's just because I used to be a sola scriptura guy.
okay,
I don't know.
Okay.
But tell me why I should care more, because I just don't.
So this is the part where, like, for example, Eusebius is making a claim about Mark, but he's having to depend on others to do it, right? So that's somebody building off of somebody's argument. So it's not independent of itself. He's having to take independent claims and corroborate them. So when Eusebius says something like the Gospel of John was written by the Apostle John, unless he has, and the nice thing about him is he's a historian, so he's trying to collect as much as he can. It's nice for him to be able to tell us what was out there and said and who is related to who and who knew who. But Eusebius's personal opinion really doesn't matter on gospel authorship because he is so far removed. He is just bringing in the evidence and trying to piece it himself. But his independent opinion doesn't matter because he wasn't connected to anything relevant to John, right?
Agree.
So Irenaeus is a heavier weight. So if I'm weighing the evidence, Irenaeus is a heavy weight. Papias seems to be familiar with John. In fact, it's interesting that the anti-Marcionite prologue states that John's scribe for the Gospel of John was Papias. Again, we can't corroborate that with anybody. So Is it true? No, maybe not. Could he have been there? He may have been in that group of people that was there. But what we do know is Papias could write. He had 5 volumes. So maybe, right. He was more skilled. But again, there's another claim that we can't corroborate. So I concede to, is it possible? Sure, I guess it's possible in light of humanity. It is a human possibility. Is it probable? Probably not. Probably not. It would have been somebody probably a lot more professional.
And like the other night, you were talking about Salome and how she has been included in all kinds of apocryphal books.
Yes.
And part of me just sees this pattern over and over is like, oh, there's a name, and early church members were writing stuff in general, taking over the names of the characters that that they had. And so I guess I don't see how just part of me is like, I just don't see how some of this, if it's happening with early, even though they're not canonical gospels, if that's something that's happening in the church, how is this not necessarily something that's happening when it comes to later? So I guess on these gospel authorships, I kind of like, hey, anything after 180, it's like clearly established, and everything after that is just kind of, and maybe it's established because it's true. Absolutely, that's possible. Maybe it's established because that's just the tradition that won out. I guess I'm trying to break the tie there. But anything after that,
I will say this, and this is where some of the Christians I disagree. If all we're left to is the patristic and church father evidence to make claim for the gospels, we have a weak case because it requires more than just statements. Because if the internal evidence does not reflect the claim, we have a problem. And we have multiple examples of this. I'm trying to think of a trailer. Let's just say Luke. Let's take Luke, for example. Yep. Spent a lot of time. I had to do my own personal translation of Luke. My favorite gospel, without a doubt. My favorite. But one of the things I learned very quickly is that I was unprepared in all the Greek classes I took for his language, because he says things. It's like, what is this word? This compound word, and
Mhm.
then you start finding, because, when you go to seminary, and you've been there, when you take Greek class, you start with the most used words in the New Testament. Your basics, your conjunctions like "hi" or something like that are always on the top of your list, or names of individuals like David, and then you work your way down through your second and third semester, and then you get to these words in your vocab that are used 2-3 times in the whole New Testament. Well, Luke's like that all the time. And so you're sitting there, and you're like, what is this word? And then you realize, oh, this is more from the classical Greek. This guy is educated
Right.
more the classical Greek. And I wish I grabbed it. I didn't grab it, but I recently, in the last couple of years, did I found a book that is almost extinct, and I'm so glad somebody reproduced it out in England. And so I found a book on some nobody professor in England, who took whatever many years he did to find all of the physician-like terms,
the
medical
one.
references.
Yeah.
And I was
Yep.
like, and it's a horrible read, by the way. I mean, it is
Well,
it's
a reference book. Yeah.
it's a reference book, and it is a cure for insomnia.
Mhm.
Because I'm sitting there at night trying to read this. The first night I was like, oh, this is going to be epic. This is going to be great. It's like, whoo, I need to do this after 2-3 cups of coffee, and I can completely understand what's going on. But you start unpacking Luke's vocabulary, and it is connected to a lot of Hippocrates and a lot of the ancient writers, and even later in time, Galen using similar things in manuals. You start finding all these physicians. And so we have all these allegations about Luke's gospel being written by a physician. And so you start getting into the internal evidence. And to me, it is undeniable whoever wrote Luke had the knowledge of physician term. It doesn't make him a physician.
And let me grant that on before I get too,
Please.
because I actually kind of hey, let me concede. A doctor wrote of the Luke Acts.
Sure.
I hate calling it Luke because I don't think anyway. But then okay, great. The source for Luke being a doctor is what? Colossians, right?
Oh, for Paul, correct. Yeah, Paul saying, the beloved physician. Gotcha. Okay, I see. Yes,
and also that's our only source for Luke being a Gentile. Although Luke would be a weird name for a Jew to have. So that's
Greek name.
And of course, you can probably anticipate. I'm not particularly convinced that Luke wrote or that Paul wrote Colossians, right? For a myriad of reasons. I don't. And I also think it's very late. So someone like me looks at all this evidence and says, okay, there's some internal medical, let's grant, I'm not as convinced as you, but I haven't studied as much, that this medical weight is a thing. Why does that get me to a companion of Paul necessarily, when I know the we passages are a whole separate thing, but that the doctor part doesn't get me there. And to me, the we passages, we agreed Luke used the author of Luke used a myriad of sources. Why are the we passages not just part of someone else's travelogue necessarily, as opposed to the person who wrote the whole thing? From my weird perspective, where I'm trying to build it all up from nothing. So I guess I know you look at that internal evidence and you like it because it affirms the thing, but we're on opposite perspectives. I'm trying to prove it's true. You're trying to see whether it affirms what you already think. Does that line of thinking make any sense? And where am I wrong in that line of thinking?
No, and again, that's where I say, and obviously I think Colossians was Paul, but even let's just say if that's just a historic claim outside of Colossians itself, you have like the anti-Marcionite prologue. Again, Luke was an Antiochian Syrian, a doctor by profession, a disciple of the apostles. The Muratorian fragment, a well-known physician that Paul took with him as a companion. And then you get into the picture. Obviously, Irenaeus says the same thing, that Luke, a companion of Paul, recorded a book of the gospel preached by him. Tertullian in North Africa. Jerome talks about the physician of Antioch. Now, this one is important to me because he says he's a physician of Antioch as his writings indicate. And that's a big deal that Jerome would say that, not because of his timeline, but because he translated the Vulgate, or at least majorly sourced it out. But in his work, he came to realize he did the same thing that I did, apparently, when he came to move it over to Latin. He started getting into Greek terms, and he's like, okay, I've got to figure out what word this is, because he was having to pull out a whole new vocabulary list to translate over from Greek to Latin. And so what he realized while translating the Vulgate is Luke's writings clearly indicate this man is a physician. So he ran into the same thing when he was changing the language over from Greek to Latin. And so I think so my point is when we look at the Gospel of Luke and its attestation, we don't see another name put there. And it coherently connects with the statement of Colossians, whether Paul wrote it or not. All these other documents and fathers are saying, yeah, there was a guy with Paul, his name was Luke. And I mean, when I remember going through the Anti-Marcionite prologue and the Muratorian fragment, if you actually just take those two documents alone, you can actually come up with a date that's within a 3-year period of when it was probably done. But I mean, it goes through multiple things about his life. The Muratorian fragment talks about him as a well-known physician, almost like he was famous for curing something or something like that. I mean, the Anti-Marcionite prologue goes through the age he was when he died. It says that he was 84 years old when he was in Britannica.
But just like for the audience, Muratorian fragment is 8th century, 9th century.
The copy we do, it's believed to be late 2nd.
Okay.
Some would put it in the 3rd.
And Jerome, sorry, I got a dog going crazy.
Oh,
Jerome is like 4th, 5th century.
Yeah, right? Jerome was 4th. Mm-hmm.
So, again, like that the Christians are coming up with more elaborate legends about the people like that much later. Does it make sense that doesn't move my needle?
But that goes back to the arguments at hand with like the Anti-Marcionite prologue or Muratorian fragment. What motivated them to put these publications out, right? Well, Anti-Marcionite prologue defines itself as to why they're putting these publications out. There needed to be clarity in the churches as to Marcion's gospel, which Tertullian said was mutilating the gospel of Luke. And so you have that rivalry of, you have a partial gospel that looks like Luke, but it's mutilated. And then you have the gospel that's been circulated in the readings of the church. And instantly you have to actually clarify, because now a corrupted version is made it in. And so some of these documents were created, like the Anti-Marcionite prologue, to clarify the history of the text that they had all along. It's not like they were creating nuanced name, like, well, let's just put a name on here.
But does it make sense to you that I'm nodding my head in agreement? All that stuff was probably happening, but that if my narrative is, for like the first 100 years or for 60 years or however many, they kind of, as you described, they weren't super caring. They cared that this is official and that it went back to eyewitnesses, but they didn't specifically care about names. But suddenly there's all these challenges, so we did care about names. When I hear all that, I kind of like go, yeah, that makes sense. That exactly makes sense. That at some point they started looking for consensus among themselves of whose names do we put on these things. Like,
yeah, I get what you're saying, but do you see a benefit of putting a John Mark or a Luke onto the Gospels, being that John Mark was perceived as a coward in the book of Acts, where he booked it the minute persecution happened to Paul's team?
Well, I guess that depends. I put so little weight on what Acts says that I don't know that Acts, like I think Acts was completely harmonizing. It was whitewashing the differences between Peter and Paul. And so I guess I'm not super sure that what is written about him, Mark, in Acts necessarily. I don't know what was known about Mark. Like, I get that Gospel of Peter would have been a better bolster, but also there were other Gospels of Peter going around. So
sure.
So if they were competing with other Gospels of Peter, then they couldn't go to that. And then, well, what's the next best thing? Oh, like I'm actually willing to grant that there was a guy named Mark who hung out with Peter, and that was known, right? Then why wouldn't that be the second best choice if they're competing with other Gospels of Peter?
Well, he's an insignificant character. Even if you don't have him in Acts, all we have is my son Mark is with me, First Peter. But then again, if you don't believe that's Peter.
But you said Mark started the church in Antioch, right? And that his tomb is, or Alexandria, pardon me, and his tomb is there now, and it was venerated by people, and there was tales of people going and venerating it. Like those seem like in conflict. You're saying, well, okay, he wasn't a big deal, but yet he became this big deal.
Well, he was a big deal on the fact that he was a disciple of Peter. So since he was a disciple of Peter and he was succeeded by Peter and actually went to Alexandria, Egypt on behalf of Peter's ministry, he started a church in Egypt. So that's what made him significant, would been not so much during his, like Acts has him in his travels with Paul. Peter says that he was like a son to him. In First Peter, again, if you accept that to be
right.
Peter. What I mean by insignificant is he's insignificant in the fact that he was not with Jesus. He wasn't there as an eyewitness, not significant in the sense of he's not an important figure in the church, because even Papias said he was neither with the Lord nor knew him. And I know that some try to say that, oh, the guy that ran away who was stripped naked in the garden in Mark's gospel is him. I actually don't think it is. I actually don't think that was him at all. Yeah. We have 3 statements in church history that Mark was never with the Lord nor knew the Lord personally. So when I say insignificant, I don't mean from a historical church perspective. I mean from he wasn't with Jesus, heard Jesus, or had anything connected to Jesus. So why would his testimony matter? Same thing with Luke. Luke's sitting there at the very beginning of the gospel, collecting the eyewitness testimony. He himself is admitting he is not one. So these two become insignificant in the sense of their secondhand information, and to put a secondhand information individual on it actually would be problematic when you're trying to get eyewitness testimony, or call them the memoirs of the apostles. You can't get memoirs from the apostles from Mark or from Luke because they weren't there to have a memory, and they weren't apostles. They're not star witnesses. They're good reporters, so to speak, in the mind of those that see the historical play out, like being a scribe, but they themselves are not significant in their eyewitness telling because neither was there to tell what happened. But I do think he's significant in history. I'm glad you brought that up. That probably needed to be clarified on my end. He's significant in history from the church's standpoint because he was a successor of Peter, but from the perspective of eyewitness, he has no benefit to us.
Right, but if your eyewitnesses are, already being mainly used up, obviously the guy who is hanging out with one of the cool eyewitnesses is a nice backup. I guess again, when I'm looking to affirm it, the notion is like, well, why did they pick these names? That seems obscure. Like that doesn't move the needle for me either. Because I wasn't there. I don't know how popular Mark was or wasn't. I don't know how authoritative Mark was or wasn't. I don't think other people do either.
Yeah, he was pretty instrumental. People had a lot of respect for him. I mean, again, you have narration,
which is arguing for a good reason to potentially, have his name be a secondary name if you're not going to use an apostle, right?
Well, then the thing would be, so if that would have been his significance. So here's my perspective, and just on Mark, I actually think the Gospel of Mark ends in the shorter ending of Mark, like most scholars do. It is of my opinion that is where Peter's material ended, and that Mark himself went back and actually finished the gospel himself and gave it its own ending after he went back to Alexandria. And and this is my opinion, I'm not saying it's a fact.
I love your opinions. They're delicious. Go for it.
So when you go to the book of 2 Timothy, which I know you would dispute is Paul, when Paul's about to be executed in 2 Timothy, he states that only Luke is with him. And when you he says to send John Mark to him, for he is now profitable. So we have to ask ourselves outside the box here. Why would Mark, who is not profitable to him before, now profitable to him, And the only explanation is at that point, he had spent time with Peter and wrote a gospel to him that had circulated. And then what that means is if John Mark was sent to Rome, which is where he was with Peter to begin with, where is he being sent from? Because at that point, he was with Peter in Rome, according to all the tradition we have. He left to go somewhere, and Paul wants him to come back before his execution. And the only person that Mark would have ran into outside of Paul, if he did make that travel as requested, is Luke. Luke was the only one that is mentioned being with Paul. And it's ironic to me that the ending of Mark, its material is extremely Lucan. You have the two disciples on the road of Emmaus, though not named, just that two are there. You have stories about snake bites not hurting anybody.
Right.
You have stories, and even the sources, for example, like drinking deadly poison and things like that. We actually have a story from Luke's eyewitness group, if you would, and this is very complex. We don't have to get into it, where there's actually a story within the relation of Philip and his 4 daughters, who I think were instrumental in getting us the book of Luke and Acts, by the way. And that's why there's a whole story dedicated to Philip in Acts 8. I think that Luke was one of his eyewitnesses were those, because one of the we passages is actually in him and Paul. Him and Paul were in Caesarea in the house of Philip with his 4 daughters and spent the night there in their home. So he received this information naturally. That's where you get chapter 8 and chapter 7. Some of chapter 7 and most of chapter 8. But if you go into this, one of Luke's sources from them is that they told a story while spending time with Papias in Hierapolis about, if you remember the beginning of Acts, you had 2 people to replace Judas. You had Matthias and you had Justus. Right. And there's a story, a legend, that Justus actually drank poison and it didn't harm him.
Interesting.
And so that's, again, that goes back to Luke's sources. And then you look at all the way through, even the commissioning is very Lucan. The long ending of Mark is extremely Lucan. And so it is my perspective, this is my opinion, is that Mark finished the Gospel of Mark to give it a proper ending after spending time with Luke, and that he actually used Luke's material to give it a proper completion, because it's a bad ending to end on Gar right there at the very end of Mark, to end on a preposition, leaving it open-ended the way it is. I think that it was finished later, and that's why there's this big dispute about the long ending and when it happened. I actually think Mark did it himself, and the reason the language is different from the beginning of the book to the last 12 verses of Mark is because he's no longer under dictation. He's writing on his own accord. That's again, my opinion. I'm not saying I'm right.
Yeah.
But this is a hypothesis that I have for the whole discrepancy on the long ending of Mark, because we have early quotes from it, like Irenaeus quotes the long ending, and a lot of manuscripts do have it. So there's got to be an explanation here, right? So it's possible in my mind, like thinking through all these texts, how did this connect? How do we get here? And to me, I think that something like that could have been possible.
And I think that demonstrates the fundamental difference between us, our approaches, because you look at all that and you're like, oh man, all this stuff gets affirmed and gets added in and is a maybe great connection and affirmation, if I'm willing to grant it all some charity. Versus I worked in film and I worked on Star Wars stuff for a long time, and
awesome.
I see, for example, I literally brought the word canon to Lucasfilm. I watched all these other stories like, hey, in episode 1, Anakin had to stand in front of these 12 members, and I was there when all of a sudden, after the movie came out, all the publishing houses came in and said, well, I want to write the stories about that Jedi Master, and I want to write the stories about that Jedi Master. And then as they flesh out, we're kind of keeping track, and they build on each other. But I know that was never George's intent, right? Like I see all the stuff build on each other, and it interconnects well. But I kind of witnessed in my lifetime that kind of living, breathing, interconnected fiction happen. And that's when I hear you describe what you were describing, that's what rolls through my head. And that's the only reason I brought that up, is because It may not be fair, it may not be right, but if
By the way,
someone's not a, go ahead.
I don't think the long ending is original. Just to be clear, I'm trying. I don't know how it came into existence later and who did it. Honestly, I it's fine. Like, I don't accept
Right.
the long ending to the same level that I do the rest of the book. But nobody has a, like, me sharing my opinion about how it came to be is no lesser or more than anybody else, because none of us know how the last 12 verses came to be.
Right.
So
I just was hearing, I guess what I was describing was I was hearing in your voice the excitement about the potential connections. And I hear in that voice the me that I used to be when I believed also loved all those kind of connections. When you'd get someone break down all the plans for the tabernacle for you in passages that you always used to sleep through, and then they connect them with all these ways that it might be fulfilled in Jesus and things like that used to really excite me, all those kind of connections and things. But I think gospel authorship primarily for a non-Christian community is about, do these things go back to eyewitnesses? Ultimately, it's a little bit weird to say, like, to quibble about, if I'm willing to grant that there's some kernels of Peter's teaching in Mark, then why are you and I quibbling at all about whether, if we both agree that some of it goes back to Peter, then why are we even talking about it? And I guess the question is, does some of it go back to Peter? And similarly, again, Luke, neither of us think Luke met Jesus. I'm guessing anyway.
No, I don't know. I don't think he was a later
right,
convert.
exactly. Sure. I guess I was coming back to, I lost my train of thought there on why this is important. Let's
see the difference. Let's see the difference between the difference between the long ending of Mark, and is we don't have any statements of how or who. We don't. As far as like how the rest of the book, the Gospel Mark as a whole, the who and the how, we have a lot of information on that. So, like, you can't, that's where Christians are dogmatic a lot of times on both levels. It's like, we're dogmatic here that Mark's gospel is Peter's, and then we treat the same dogma here as we do the long ending or something like that. And it's like, but we have absolute silence on the origination of this. We have a lot of comments on the origination of this. And so I refuse to treat those two things as equal.
That's fair.
So, I mean, they're not. And so I think the issue that you and I have, what you were saying earlier about evangelicalism, is the dogmatic approach to everything. Dogmatic approach. So if somebody were to look at the long ending argument that I make, and somebody would say, if evidence came out tomorrow and showed how the long ending was put together, would you reshape your position and rethink your position because of the evidence? Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm not going to stay in something that's wrong. The problem is we don't know, and everybody's guessing. And so everybody's giving their best guesses. Because it is a interesting dilemma in those long endings. And I don't defend them the same way a lot of Christians do. Same thing with the story of the woman caught in adultery.
Right.
Some of the biggest criticism I ever got was I wrote an entire paper on why it didn't belong in the Gospel of John. And, you get hate mail for that kind of stuff. I always joked. I was like, I am at greater risk of being stoned than the woman caught in adultery for believing that the woman caught in adultery doesn't belong in the Gospel of John, because I got so much hate mail for writing, I don't believe it's original. I gave my internal reasons, the manuscript reasons. And so it's interesting how all that unpacks. So the way I approach a textual variant like that versus the wholeness of John's gospel, I take two different levels, and I don't treat them equal, because one is speculative and one is a lot of evidence. So just to be clear, I wanted to clarify that.
Fair enough. I do have a couple of more topics that we could potentially talk on. That said, we are getting past the top of the hour, and I know we didn't want to go super long. We have a few super chats, but I also wanted to, I know in the last couple of videos, there have been, not maliciously in any way, but it has been suggested that I misrepresented you, or that I may have, that the audience may have watched my videos coming away thinking that you believe things that maybe you didn't. So I wanted to make sure that you had time today to either clarify anything you thought I misrepresented you on, or to ask me any questions of that whole process, because I want to make sure you have at least a few minutes of time. If you do have beefs with me, that we get those out as well.
Sure. No, I think we clarified quite a bit just in this conversation alone. Some of the things that I wasn't sure of was statements I made earlier in the video that were applied to the end of the video in relation, I think it was to Matthew, if I remember correctly. And to me, believing that Matthew penned original statements of Jesus in a proto-Matthean form, and they were sayings, as Papias said they were, and that others later actually came together in a group, either in Antioch, Jerusalem area, to publish a gospel from other church headquarters. Because we have statements that say that Matthew's gospel was translated by individuals, and that there was a translation process that happened, and all of it's in Jerusalem for that matter. Like, to me, that doesn't mean they're anonymous. I'm not saying that they'd be anonymous, especially if Matthew is still heading up the process. Even if John is the main narrator of the Gospel of John, which I believe he was, he's the main narrator, but it's a group gospel. They wanted it to be in his name, and it makes sense that it would be in his name because he was one of the three. But even in that, I have no problem attributing it to the Gospel of John, or even saying this is a Johannine community gospel. And if it's a Johannine community gospel, then it's no longer anonymous in that relation. Like, I guess you could say that it's not as certain of a individual since it's multiple and some of them aren't named, but who they were is actually what was important. And that's why I think that they're referred to often as the memoirs of the apostles. And I use Justin Martyr as an example because Justin Martyr uses the statement, the memoirs of the apostles. But then when he needed to clarify one of those accounts about the sons of Zebedee, he had no problem saying that the gospel, quoting the section, which is Mark, to be Peter's memoirs. He did go explicit to a name, but as a whole, he looked at them as the memoirs of the apostles. And I think that's intentional because the churches knew the gospels went back to the eyewitnesses. That was the point. To have Matthew's name on it as the only name to be would have been like if I worked on a group project in school, sometimes the main driver behind the project gets the credit or his name on the project first and the others follow. To me, it's a little bit disingenuous, maybe that's the word I'm looking for, to actually go, this is the gospel of Matthew, as if it's only Matthew. I believe Matthew is the main guy. He started the process. He collected the original statements, but I don't think that we can just contribute the entire gospel of Matthew that we have today to one man, although we do. And I have no problem saying the gospel of Matthew because it gets really muddy when you start trying to add, well, the gospel of Matthew and the leaders in Jerusalem's gospel, now it's a sentence, not a title. I think that when we see these things happen, like with Marcion, putting the name of the main guy on there, like Luke's gospel is a perfect example. He wasn't an eyewitness. He gives you hints all through his gospel who he was using to get his stories. His name would not be as important as theirs, but yet he is writing to a Theophilus, whether that's an individual or a code name. There's good debate on both. But he himself is not the point of the gospel. It's telling the testimony of those who did know Jesus or did see these things. And he collects those statements and publishes for them, because many of them were probably illiterate, and publishes for them their testimony in a written form that he was giving to the churches for their behalf. The churches know the stories. John's gospel, for example, assumes you know stories about individuals in his account. In chapter 11, when he shows up at the tomb of Lazarus, you have the sister, Mary Martha. He goes on and says, this is the same Mary that anointed Jesus' feet. Well, he doesn't tell you that until chapter 12, but he assumes you already know. There's a lot of assumptions in the Gospels that they assume the audience of the church knows names, people, places, and items. There's a lot of assumption there. I think it required later the defense of this when the Marcions of the world came into fight back against the gospel. The names were being given to these gospels in order for clarification at that point. So I don't think it's that the churches never knew where they came from. Again, Tertullian argued against the idea of Marcion trying to slip in an anonymous gospel to the churches, and that was the biggest reason he got caught, is trying to put in some sort of gospel without a name on it. And Tertullian's like, that was a mistake. So I think the names were always known, but I think it's disingenuous to say that the Gospel of John is strictly John. I think it was a Johannine community. That's the term I put on it. It's the Johannine community. I think that the Gospel of Matthew is the gospel that was given by the headquarters church at Jerusalem. I think Matthew started the process. We have multiple statements of that, starting with Papias and others, that he collected and wrote an account for Jesus. We see things in it that make sense of that too, like the tax collector terminology. He has the most usage of coins in the Roman Empire and different terms for it than, say, Luke or Mark. We have this interest in publications of land and purchases. So again, you see connections like, okay, it seems like maybe somebody was familiar with legal laws of transactions and money and coinage and so forth. So but then there's places where it's like,
before we go too much further,
please jump in.
I want to remember my notes, but also was anything in there criticism of me and my videos, or was that in general clarification?
General clarification. Okay. I think that the criticism part was the only criticism part, and to revisit that, is that maybe there was this statement that I was agreeing with you on anonymity, when I think that anonymity is not anonymity. I think it is complex, that has traced roots to eyewitnesses, but it's not as simple as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It has to be a lot more than just that. And there needs to be an asterisk next to Matthew. There's an asterisk next to John.
Okay.
But maybe you were agreeing. Maybe you weren't saying
well,
that.
Actually, so what I think I was doing there was you, I think you were affirming for me that in the first number of decades, the average person sitting, they didn't have pews, but whatever they were sitting on instead of pews, didn't care who wrote those books. I think you seemed like you were affirming with me that was not of utmost concern for the first 50, 80 years.
The title with a single person's name.
Right.
They would have seen it as the memoirs of the apostles or the gospel of the Lord, because the accounts were about him, not about the authors, the writers. They would have seen it as the gospel of the Lord, the memoirs of the apostles. That would have been the most important.
And that's all I meant to convey. Where you and I were in agreement that I think I buy that story. I buy the story that for that first 80 years, they weren't super concerned about, exactly, that it should be Matthew's name.
Okay, so if I misrepresented you, I apologize.
No, you didn't. Because
I thought you were saying that you and me were both saying, well, then therefore you should just conclude they're anonymous, when I think there's more to it to be explained that doesn't leave anonymity there. It's just, it wasn't necessary for them. Okay, so
we're to everyone listening now, that's the narrow bit of agreement is on that narrow bit of agreement.
Okay, good.
Very good.
Thanks for clarifying.
Let's say I grant, I guess I could also grant very much that, no, I shouldn't say that, but let's, for the sake of this discussion, Matthew wrote some Hebrew sayings down, right? Or Aramaic sayings, probably. And then other people came in and they took obviously Mark as one of the sources for
very much
gospel.
So. Very much so.
And they obviously had Q or something like it. I'm guessing you would agree. And
I think the Q is the sayings of Matthew.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
So
So I was going to say,
I don't accept the Q. I'm more where Dr. Goodacre is on that one.
okay.
Um,
So I was going to say Q would be like, I was going to say Q is going to be a lot like what you're just describing. So, but sure, we
correct.
can conflate them for
I
this
think it's the
conversation.
missing Q that everybody's looking for. But go
That's
ahead.
fine. Okay, so let's say Matthew wrote Q for the sake of this discussion in Aramaic. What explanatory power does it give us to say that Matthew was involved with this specific compilation when you would say that Luke used also Mark and Q? We're saying Matthew wrote Q. That was also a source for Luke, but you don't think Matthew was involved in what Luke did. Why? What explanatory power or what evidence is there? I suppose you said tax collector stuff that Matthew was involved with the Matthew project. Like Matthew could have easily died after he wrote Q, and everything still proceeded.
Sure. The only part I would put on that is that when you look at Irenaeus' statement, for example, and he says that while Peter and Paul were in Rome starting churches, Matthew wrote this. So that puts us in the 60s, so to speak, if you put a date on that, on his timeline there, because Paul didn't make it to Rome till probably late 58 at earliest 60, closest to reality in his travel to Rome. So you have Irenaeus making a statement about that happening in this process. Everyone alleges it to Matthew. There isn't a single patristic or father who makes any other statement about it being anybody but Matthew. And Matthew's not an ideal. I mean, he was one of the 12. I don't want to downplay the guy. But he's not a significant person as like, say, James or John at that point, because John came later. And we have statements that John is actually involved in possibly the association of the work of the Matthew that's been translated to Greek. So why not just throw John's name on it? To me, why would all these patristics again, and then again, Papias gives it to Matthew, but what Papias says about Matthew is not our Matthew.
He gives Q to Matthew. I might be on this Matthew wrote Q train. We'll see how this goes.
Okay, watch out. I think it was what he said, and this bothered me. I'm going to be honest with you. Matthew bothered me for a long time. It's like, what the church fathers all said was Matthew. Okay, but they all said it was in a Hebraic or a language that is not Greek, either Hebrew or Aramaic. So what they're saying is, yes, Matthew wrote it, but what they're saying is not the Matthew that we have. It can't be. And Jerome sitting there saying that he has a copy of a Hebrew Matthew that was in the library of Caesarea that Pamphilus the martyr had transcribed, and the Ebionites wanted a copy of it. And so I was like, okay, so whatever it wasn't even in circulation anymore.
Right.
And the closest thing that
all that could be true, and Matthew not have had one bit of involvement in what we currently consider the first gospel, right? But like he could have died immediately after writing.
He could have.
Everything you said would still be true.
Yes, and I'm fine conceding that. By the way, I'm fine conceding Matthew was not in the editorial process.
Okay.
All right. I think by Irenaeus' statement and timeline, it would make sense that he would be, but I'm fine if he's not. But even if he was the main driver to make an account like this, and it took other editors, the key to me for Matthew is, were the eyewitnesses doing this? Was it authorized church individuals who were entrusted with this, who published it? And if we go back to the Church of Jerusalem and Antioch, and we have names like, say, James, Barnabas, or John, whoever, what other names that are thrown out on the translation process, if they were involved in the narration and filling in gaps and being a part of the work, you still have eyewitnesses who are producing this text from Mother Church. And if Mother Church is sending it out from Jerusalem or Antioch to the other Greek churches, they're not going to accept it unless it comes from authorized people. Somebody has to approve that. Again, Tertullian said they're not taking anonymous gospels. It needed to be from something credible.
They weren't taking them after. Tertullian was like 360 or whatever it was.
No, he's in the 200s.
Is he in the 200s?
Tertullian?
Okay.
Now you got me doubting myself.
Unless I'm thinking of the wrong person.
You got me
You're talking
doubting
about
myself.
the lawyer in Africa, right?
North Africa. Mm-hmm.
Oh,
I'll get his date for you because
all
now
right.
you got me second guessing myself here. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead. Make your point. Make your point either way.
The point is, either way, it's after what I. Oh, you're right. It's closer to 200. Yeah, pardon me.
Like,
That's me. That's all after what I would consider to be they had started locking down Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
he was 155 to 220. He died in 220.
Right. So he was born around the time when I think these traditions started to get solidified for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does not surprise me that then when other gospels after that point are trying to sneak in anonymously, they're like, whoa, we did that once and we're not doing it anymore. Like that doesn't necessarily tell me that in the 120s or the 100s that wasn't something that slipped in, right? Because these are processes that get refined over time.
Sure, but Tertullian's argument of that is that the archived statements and scripts about these individuals and these gospels were held in the churches universally. So as his lawyer instincts kick in, he's looking for document trails. He uses the analogy of the deeds, the good deeds. So you have the deeds not in like works, but like licensed legal deeds, like a deed of a house.
Mm-hmm.
He uses the analogy of land. And his point is if I'm going to go find who the original owners were, I mean, you do this in the car business and stuff, you get a title, right? You get a title, and on it you have the first owner who transferred the title to this person, who transferred the title to this person. You might be the fourth person that owns that vehicle. But you have within that multiple ways to look at where this came from, when it came into practice, who had it, when, where, why, and how. So again, he's looking at it from the laydown, and he gives examples. He uses Peter, for example, and his student Clement in Rome. He uses John and he uses Polycarp. And he's basically saying these are the records of the churches. They're all saying the same thing. He's looking at the fullness of the church, and he goes, this is what we're getting. This is where they came from. These were passed on through the deeds of this person to this person. The bishops were the guardians. He talks about them being guardians. They were guardians of what was passed down to them, as Paul called the deposit. They're given a deposit of belief and faith and what they held to. And it would be a problem. It would be a problem, say, if the churches of North Africa, where he was, had a different record than the churches of Constantinople about the Gospel of John. One saying that it was this writer and another saying it's this writer. It'd be problematic. But what Tertullian found in his investigation of these things in the East, because he mentions John's churches, and then he mentions Peter's churches in the West.
Well, let's not use John, because there was quite a bit of like, which John are we talking
which John?
about? Is
the Johannine community in the East.
Okay.
I like calling them the Johannine. By the way, I think second and third John was written by a different John. I think second and third John epistles are not the same as John the Apostle. Just FYI.
Sounds good. All right. Well, that's all along the lines of, I think we've been over this a little bit, like that's in the line of church tradition, church father stuff that I don't come along for the ride for. Sure. But I think that I think we got that category stuff covered. Let's answer the super chats we have. And then if there's topics out of that we want to talk about, or if there's something you want to bring up after, but let's get these covered so that we have that done. Myth Vision podcast. Thank you, Myth Vision. Derek, would Stephen still be a Christian if he didn't believe the miracle stories about Jesus ever happened as recorded? Resurrection, virgin birth, etc.
Probably not. It's a good question. That's Derek, isn't it? Yeah, that's Derek.
Yeah, that's Derek. Yeah.
Probably not. I mean, I'm one of those people. If that's not true, what else isn't true? Like, I mean, what else is fabricated? Especially the resurrection. If the resurrection isn't true, what's the point of being a Christian? Paul said, if Christ is not risen, you're dead in sins. You might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So, no, I mean, if those things weren't true, I wouldn't be a Christian anymore. If I didn't believe them to be true, I would not be a Christian. There's no point.
Can you understand why someone like me now says, like, the Jerusalem zombies? Like, if that's not true, well, then well, again, like as soon as I was the kind of Christian that very much as soon as it was, if it's only 99% true, you may as well throw it in the garbage. That was how I grew up. And so once
Sure.
I found it was only 99% true, then I was literally like, well, then what can be true? So so it sounds like you're at least sympathetic to that notion that there is a slippery slope eventually.
I am very sympathetic. And if this screws my camera up, I'm sorry. I'm getting notification. It's dying. And I thought it was plugged in this whole time. I might have to change cameras back. I'm going to try it again. We alive?
Yep.
Excellent. See, I got to do it on purpose for it not to mess up. So if I'm one of those people that is looking at friends of mine who left the Christian faith and they see the same problems I see, I have nothing but sympathy, because it is difficult at times to accept certain things or to try to come up with a coherent explanation for certain things. I have never looked at one of my friends who walked away from the Christian faith and said, well, you're just an idiot. I usually, and they don't usually leave like excited and parading either. They usually leave in tears. And I mean, I can think of individuals I've cried with. I mean, I don't see that. I don't see that as anything that's worthy of looking down at somebody and saying, you're just a complete moron. You're an idiot. I don't think that's the way to handle it. And I am sympathetic about some of the things that they struggle with, because if every Christian is being honest, they do too. But where we land may be different, but at the same time, there are passages, there are problems in Scripture that on the surface seem like an issue that you have to do your investigated due diligence to come to a reasonable conclusion to figure out what you believe and why you believe it. And you better have a darn good reason for it, or a good explanation for it, because I don't believe faith is blind. I don't believe Christianity is a blind faith. And so there are things that are difficult that people choose to just say, you know what, I can't with that. And I don't sit there and say, I mean, then you just don't care about evidence, do you? I don't look that way at people.
Love that answer. Chris, welcome, Chris, friend of the channel. Super chat. Papias was criticized for being gullible, including compiling fake sayings of Jesus from all over. Irenaeus also conflated different Johns together. He didn't know what he was saying accurately here. I think there might be further parts to this. Oh no, that's the whole. So that's a comment, I guess. I don't. Did you have feedback on that comment, or we just?
I addressed that a little bit. Papias was criticized by Eusebius on certain things for sure, but again, when I look at the record here, I'm not looking for a perfectionist or a guy who gets it right every time. And neither was Eusebius when making that criticism of Papias. He clearly had it out for Papias because he could not stand his view on the coming kingdom being a literal 1,000 years. Eusebius couldn't stand that about it. and it was like, it was in his crawl or something where he just couldn't let that go. And he would find a way to jab at Papias quite a bit, like statements that are his gullibleness. But at the same time, he used him to corroborate the Gospel of Mark with Clement of Alexandria. That's why I've said over and over and over again, if we're just going off Papias, we're all screwed. But at the end of the day, even Eusebius saw value in some of his claims and connectivity. And I think that there's even points where Eusebius doesn't even continue on with Papias. He just cuts him off and doesn't tell us what he says because he doesn't like what he has to say. He doesn't tell us what he said about John. I think he did that on purpose. In fact, Richard Bauckham makes an argument that he intentionally doesn't make his opinion of John because he knows people aren't going to like it. And so there may be some plausibility to that there. The idea of John's being one or two is definitely up for debate. So when you look at whether there's this John the Elder and John the Apostle, are they one and the same, and how they look at that? When you look at Irenaeus and others, they tried to actually consider the fact that there's two monumentals out there. When you look at tombstones and monuments, there were two different John locations, and even Jerome said there were two different John locations. So are there two Johns out here, or is there one John? John's a popular name, Jesus had other disciples that weren't listed. I actually hold that there were 2 Johns. Some believe there were 1, and even some of the early fathers didn't know how to deal with that, whether there were 1 or 2. And they were even looking like, well, we got 2 graves. Does that equal 2 Johns or just 2 monuments for 1 guy? So there is some good discussion on that, but I don't think that was an issue in the sense of like, well, just because, again, he also thought Jesus was 50. Are we going off an independent statement and we only have 1 independent statement from Irenaeus or Papias? No, we need to corroborate that with the others that are making similar statements. In addition to that, we can't hang it on 1 single quote.
So when it comes to Papias, is it fair to say, I think you've granted me that it's fair to say that whatever document Papias was talking about for Matthew was not what we hold as our first gospel. You would agree with that. He had a different document, a proto-Matthew or whatever we want to call it. And then I also think that I think that's slightly bolstered by the fact that when Papias describes Judas's death, it doesn't in any way line up with our Matthew. Right. So he obviously didn't consider our Matthew as the authoritative version of how Judas died. So I think that's enough, but you would agree with me probably on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think it was a proto-Matthean collection.
And then I just sort of see the same thing with what he's describing as Mark. I just think he had a document that had Mark's name on it that wasn't exactly the same document that we had. And you probably think that it could have been. I just kind of see those in the same camp. I don't know why I'm even throwing that in. Next super chat. So, as someone who publishes a lot on family history, family oral lore is notoriously unreliable, even for great-grandparents. My great-grandfather has 3 contradictory oral death accounts. Okay.
Well, again, I mean, that might be the case for one person's family, but I mean, at the end of the day, we have to throw away a lot of history when we start on this trail, Paul. I really do. I mean, when we start on this, we have, and I know there's people that have their perspective on this. I was actually shocked to find that there's some people fine with Socrates being a myth and things like that. We don't have any writings of Socrates. We don't have any statements from him that were, I mean, it's his disciples that are doing it. It's his trainees that are actually reporting to us the teachings of Socrates and stuff. Secondhand passed down. And in fact, when I debated Godless Engineer, oh man, that was 2 years ago. I did all the comparatives of the New Testament, Jesus, and the writings that go back to Socrates and how neither one of them wrote a document, but yet there's a lot said about him. And here's the closest companions to him, and did the comparative and how many years are separated between them. And they're virtually the same. And it was shocking that actually Godless Engineer, he actually said, I'm fine with Socrates being a myth. It's like, okay, well, but so my point is the history, we apply this history to the Gospels. If we're willing to do this everywhere else, we're back in the Dark Ages. We don't know anything. A lot of information is secondhand passed down through a tradition to somebody. And again, with the Gospels, it's not like we're working off one statement. There are differences in the how and the when, but not the who. And I want to keep bringing that to remembrance. There is no dispute about the who. It's the when and the how that we're mostly arguing about in the patristics. And so to me, that's universally consistent across the world. But when it comes to this rule, if we're going to apply this kind of practice, we lose so much of history as credible. A lot of history.
But then again, a lot of that history that you're talking about, if we learned tomorrow that Caesar never crossed the Rubicon,
sure,
no one's life changes.
Sure,
no one believes different things. No one asks that pass different laws. So it's a little different, or at least for some of us, it is.
I could sympathize with that. I'm not against evidence unraveling at this point. And what little we have at that time is just there seems to be so many people connected to the right people. There's the succession that we've talked about there that Tertullian was getting into. At that point, I would be shocked to find some new alleged writer of these four gospels that comes out in some document that was dug out in Egypt in the sands that says, oh, actually, we now have a new alleged name. It wouldn't shock me if we find another person of interest who's involved in one of these gospels. In fact, I welcome it, because my whole hypothesis in Matthew is that there were individuals that were named, listed as being a part of the project. If 2 or 3 or 4 more come out, it just makes my argument that much more plausible. So I just don't think we're going to find a different.
But at the same time, none of that is incompatible, as far as I'm concerned. None of that's incompatible with the notion that between 120 and 185, that just got solidified, that the people started to become in lockstep.
Yeah, we might differ on why that needed to happen, I guess. Like why Matthew's name was now being slapped on some manuscripts that were transcribed.
Maybe.
Probably, I would think.
Yeah. But at the same time, like I hear that, but I still feel like it's compatible with just it so at some point relatively in that zone got solidified. So
I think it became more a publicized. I think it became more publicized. If that's a word I'm going to put on it. I think the publication of the names was in that window you just gave.
Yeah.
I think the assumed knowledge was up to that point all along. And anybody, again, most people are sitting in church listening to oral readings because most of them couldn't read a written reading. And so what was taught to them would have been just memorization, public readings in their gatherings, which again, Justin Martyr talks about. Somebody would come up, they would read it. There would be an explanation from the president. So those things would definitely not have been like, oh, we've got to make sure somebody puts this name on the top of this manuscript before we can read it in church. It wouldn't have been a priority to them. Once the time frame you gave, by the way, I think is an excellent time frame, 120 to say 180. Mm-hmm. Well, what we know about that time frame is that's when rival gospels started actually escalating, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip. These started escalating at that time. And it would make far more sense, especially when they are making the allegation, I, Didymus Thomas, at the very beginning, or I, Simon Peter, and my brother went fishing. Boom, manuscript falls off on the Gospel of Peter. And by the way, I have my own translation of that gospel, and I loved it, enjoyed it. But it makes you abundantly clear. It wants you to know, I am Simon Peter, and I went fishing. We don't have that kind of punch in our 4 gospels the way that the Gnostic, so to speak, the ones that were found in the Nag Hammadi collection, those Nag Hammadi gospels came to rise in that window. So that goes back to my premise. Marcion's doing what he's doing over there. Gnostic gospels are coming out all over the place. It almost forces the hand of a transmitted text to now actually validate whatever name, the narrator of John being John the Apostle, going back to him, or Matthew, even if he wasn't at the group editing, he started the process. So therefore he gets the credit for it. It would make perfect sense why they had to start chanting names the way they do in that time zone, seeing the rise of all that's happening in those years.
Right. And I think the explanatory power is identical, whether those were the real names or just the names they were agreeing upon. That's where I'm at.
Understood.
Chris's continuation, I'm guessing, if tradition is analogous to family history per Stephen, it is unreliable and highly fictive. We have no evidence Papias' claims are even reliable. Ancient writers made up source claims all the time. I don't know if you have anything to add to that statement.
Yeah. So if I don't know my great-grandfather, we use the same analogy. And my grandfather saying what he learned or knew of my grandfather or great-grandfather, and then my aunt who knew my great-grandfather is saying the same thing, and then I have a great aunt who is saying the same thing. Now I'm not just taking my grandfather's word for it. This goes back to what I'm saying. It's not an independent claim. You have independent claims that are being corroborated. Now you have, if somebody says your great-grandfather had blue eyes and I don't have a picture of him and nobody has a picture of him.
Well, he was Mennonite, so yes.
So I tell you, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. So if I got my grandfather saying it, my great
Yep.
aunt saying it, my aunt saying, who all knew him and saw him, they're all saying the man had blue eyes. For me to continue to be suspicious about that, it's just not a good way to approach things. Because they're
But
all saying
wouldn't
the same thing.
Sure, but I think lots of times, the family stories, in my partner's family, we suddenly have found out that, there were babies that no one knew about, and
Sure.
and you get DNA tests sometimes proving that certain stories, didn't line up with what Grandpa was saying. So I guess, all those are things are slushy possible.
Well, yeah,
Just
I mean,
because
and information can be inaccurate, and new information comes out. And a lot of times what happens is the information wasn't fully inaccurate at first. It was just not contextualized. There was more to the story in the story itself. And that's what I think we see happen develop in these gospels over the years that you're talking about, is context is now coming out. Like, it's not as simple as a simple claim of an author. It's like, oh, the process here was actually quite complex. There's rise of false teachers. It required X, Y, Z. And so that's the point. Like, I think over time in history, when these writings are coming out in the historical attestation, we're seeing this tradition now brings out, this is what was going on during the time of John. Oh, that's why he comes out swinging his fist in chapter 1. He's clearly got an issue with the Gnostic theology that denies the physicality of Jesus. But once we start actually seeing these rival gospels, which went disappear, like, the Nag Hammadi, most of those gospels were only legend, and what we knew of them was fragmented.
right.
And so now that we can actually see them, and I've read through all of them, and I've spent hours writing research on each of them, of the main ones, I should say the main ones. It's like, I start to understand now why Irenaeus said what he said. I am starting to understand now why Clement said what he said. You can actually get better context from what they're saying and doing. It's not that what they were saying was necessarily wrong at first. It's like, oh, I see the bigger picture here. And there's more information that maybe Clement didn't have that this guy does over here. He has more information, and it makes sense why this was happening in history. That's why I think the development over time was actually good for the Gospels, because we're getting a fuller picture, not a singular city or a singular church group bringing it all out.
And that all just sounds like legendary development to me. All right. Gray's 174. Do you think Ignatius was the kid that sat on Jesus's lap? Oh, shoot. For the "you must be like little children or enter the kingdom of heaven" saying? Is that a thought that some people have?
Actually, it is. It is a statement about Ignatius that I seriously doubt to be true. Again, it can't be corroborated with anything, but there is actually, believe it or not, there is a statement that he was a little child that Jesus brought in and said, unless you have the faith of a little child. And that's why he was called the God bearer. The name given to him in his letters is the God bearer. They associate that Jesus holding up. My co-host and I did three episodes on Ignatius of Antioch. We covered all of the 7 undisputed letters as opposed to those that are disputed. And we talked about actually that very thing. And we both said, is it possible? Yeah. Is it probable? Nah. So no, I don't think.
I have a quibble with your podcast name, Facts, because it's just hard to find, because you type facts into any podcast thing, and there's so many podcasts that have the word facts in the title.
Is it really?
It's just hard to find.
Find the Jerusalem cross. If you find the Jerusalem cross, you found me. And actually, it was actually the second one. I had coffee this morning with a guy, and he was right there in front of me, and he went on Spotify and he put facts in, and it was the second one on the list.
Oh,
I was
very
shocked. Good. So maybe we're getting somewhere. I don't know.
Maybe you're better on Spotify than on Apple. But
I think so.
I did find you because there will be, and I will put links in the description. They're not there right now, but I will absolutely put links to at least the YouTube channel.
I was saying, to be clear, so yeah, the YouTube channel is, so it used to be Explore Christianity's YouTube channel, and we kind of absorbed it just a few months back. And so Facts has always been, it's been a podcast for 2.5 years. We just now started actually doing the YouTube with the audio. And so that's a few months old. But yeah, so that's new. that'd be great. The link there. We just now started putting a lot of episodes on there. So it's nice. We actually get to record the live stream, download the audio, and then instantly upload it to the podcast within 15 minutes of the live stream. It's great. It killed two birds with one stone.
Awesome. With this Ignatius thing, do you see why when there's stories like this that I, in my head, think, man, there's a lot of stories about these connections floating around, and that, you know, if there's exaggerations here, how do I, if Polycarp didn't say it himself, maybe it's an exaggeration? Like, does that make sense to you?
Okay. That goes back to the corroboration part. Like, nobody can corroborate that.
Right.
Yeah.
Shannon Q. Welcome, Shannon Q. I need Stephen to help me understand my flow chart. I can't connect Salome to Peter, even conjecture about who she was, any relationship entailing she'd recounted her experience seems like additional layer of conjecture.
Okay. I'll do the best I can. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe she can answer this in the chat. I sent her a response with a new sheet of paper and some arrows. I don't know if that helped. Maybe not. She didn't respond back on Twitter, so that's why.
Well, the question is, how do you connect? Are you just hypothesizing that Salome knew Peter? Or are you just saying geographically they were in a position to potentially bump into each other?
Well, if she is the mother of James and John, we know James and John's families were in the same fishing business with Peter and Andrew. So, I mean, they were all friends together.
Okay, so you're based on Mark alone, we don't have that conjecture, but you're adding in the conjecture from from Matthew and from
it'd be John. Matthew. It is Matthew, and then church history. That's premise one. If that's the if premise number one.
Right.
Premise number two, the writer of Mark hardly brings naming into a situation, especially 3. And that was the point I was making in the video. He only brings in names of people and silences the other and sets of 3 at the end there because he wasn't, if it is Peter, he wasn't there. But he doesn't do that in the rest of the book.
So that's the connection. So the premise is if they've got a name in Mark, Peter knew them, essentially, is
he would name
your
them.
Rule of thumb.
Because he says he lists Mary Magdalene, he lists Mary, the mother of Joseph and James, and then he mentions Salome, and then he says, and other women. He just completely leaves them out of the equation, whereas some of the other gospels actually list which women those were. So yeah, I mean, it's again, it just depends on how you view Salome and the tradition about her, even in the Diatessaron, actually making her distinguished from the mother of James and John. But whoever she is, she's significant and she's named by Peter, where Matthew leaves her out, doesn't even name her. And then you have John that doesn't name her, and then you have Luke that doesn't name her. She's clearly in there for a reason by name, not only at the crucifixion, but also at the resurrection. So the connection is somewhere, somehow, she is connected to Peter, or if you don't believe it's Peter, whoever the writer is,
right? This
woman is important to him to put her in 2 scenarios that the other gospel writers seem to not have knowledge of, or at least information from.
I think the question was, where is the ... line from Salome to Peter? And so you're saying the disciples knew each other's moms is essentially
if she is James and John's mom.
Yeah. Okay.
They were all fishing together. They were always seen fishing together.
Okay. Northern Spike. What is Luke's last name? What other works did he write? I joined late, so I'm unsure if this is conjecture or backed up by evidence.
His last name was the Physician. I don't know. They didn't have last names back there. They were known by their dad's name or something.
He also wrote Acts.
Yes, I don't think anybody disputes if whoever wrote Luke wrote Acts. I don't think anybody disputes that.
Thank you, Northern Spike. I think that was meant a bit of a lighthearted joke, so I appreciate you. Trays 174. Was Tertullian saying that they had multiple records of transmission, like the Hadith in Isnad? I'm not trying to say that. Are any of those extant?
So what he's talking about is the archived of the bishops. I think I'm answering his question. I think I understand what he's asking.
Okay.
So when Tertullian was looking at, say, the Eastern churches, they had traditions that were taught both orally, but they also had registration. He talks about the registration of those things. I mean, the Catholic Church to this day has their succession list. The Coptic churches have their succession list, even showing where the splits happened. So I think the point that Tertullian was making is you want to know the truth, find the bishop, and find the bishop that was assigned to this that goes back. And he uses the term apostolic men. So Tertullian had two terms, the apostles and apostolic men. People that were in the apostolic men category were like Mark and Luke, who were not apostles and didn't know Jesus, but were trained by him. Then he uses other terms or other individuals like Clement and Polycarp. So what he's saying is that these records are left in the churches to be unquestioned. So there's individuals named as bishops of those churches. And this is the tradition that they had. And it's not just random churches. It's churches that John started, or churches that Peter started, or churches that Andrew started in Constantinople. Or if you want to bring it down to Mark in Alexandria, Mark started. These churches left their records through their successors. That's why you have stories like Peter of Alexandria going to the tomb of Mark on his way to execution, asked for access to go to the tomb. He saw it as sentimental. He saw that his death was worthy of an apostle's death because he stayed the course and stayed true and taught what he was always told to, and you could die in peace. So they continue the succession. So it would be archival. It would be written.
Like you're saying, these were not, they weren't written, so they can't be extant. Is that what
no? I think they were written. I think a lot of them were written because he mentions them as written. But I think that the bigger issue is that they were traditionally passed on through in other places through tradition of oral tradition, not the written tradition. But they had to have been written traditions because they still claim to this day all their successions of names. They have the names of every individual from the beginning of the apostles till today. They got them somewhere in a written tradition.
Jacate, and I'm not very good with always the screen names. Jacate Winky 77.
Okay.
Stephen, if you rely on the miracles of Jesus for your beliefs, how do you deal with the claims of the miracles from other faiths?
How do I deal with them?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think God is limited to a single people. Even the scripture teaches that God rains grace on the just and the unjust, and that God has showed his grace to the whole world in places. So, I mean, if I'm going to limit the scope of miracles to Jerusalem or to the Jews, and that only those things can happen for them, I'm kind of limiting the Bible's own claims to itself. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. If somebody sat there and said, I'll give you an example in Christendom. I had a guy the other day who went said that he visited the Vatican in Rome, and he went to St. Peter's tomb, and he had this horrible sciatic pain for years. And he went and he prayed and he put his hand on Peter's tomb, and from how many years ago that was, he has yet to have that sciatic pain again. Could it be a modern day miracle? I mean, I ain't gonna sit here and tell this guy that he didn't have back pain, and that now he doesn't have that back pain because something happened. Is that the standard of Christianity? No. But is it possible? Sure. Are there possibilities of other religions praying to their God and seeing something supernatural happen? Sure. I mean, who am I to sit here in South Carolina and say, yeah, they're all liars? I'm not in the business of really doing that. I believe God is not bound to a singularity audience or people or time. If God wants to do something miraculous for people outside of the Christian faith, he has every right and reason to do it in his own. So no, I don't have a problem with it. I don't sit here and go, oh my goodness, I don't know what to say. There's miracles happening over here. Like, it just, God can do whatever he wants. I'm not going to bound him.
But how about, for example, Muhammad riding a flying horse?
Okay, so these are claims of,
or Dionysus creating wine, right?
Sure. But again, when we look at those stories, can we 100% say that didn't happen, right? Maybe it did. But there's so many problems in, say, Muhammad's story, because Muhammad himself believed certain things were happening that others had to convince him of. So again, I don't think every case is the same. They're case by case scenarios. Let's take down Muhammad. Let's talk about his claim. Who's corroborating that claim? Is there any witnesses? How many witnesses? What did they write? Like, that would be like separate than turning something into wine. Those are separate things, because you would break them down very differently than you would, say, the Muhammad case. But for me to sit here and say 100%, absolutely not. No way, no possible way that ever happened. I just don't think I can be the person to say that. It's very, very, very unlikely. Almost.
I'll tell on myself a little bit here. When I was a Christian, I totally was very much want to believe on all that stuff. But I would just say demons did it. Like, in my head, it was demons, right? It was because we know demons have certain amount of power to do certain things. And they may well be trying to lead people astray. So that's me just telling on myself for no good reason.
And no, to answer Kip, no, we don't accept all miracle claims. Not what I'm saying. My point is, I can't be the one that sit here and say absolutely 100% not. That never happened. Not in a million years. No way, no how. My point is I doubt it. A lot of miracle claims, I would say I doubt it. Very unlikely. Not plausible. I'm speaking in terms, and maybe Kip's not understanding me. And Kip and I are friends. So, I mean, we'll talk later. But the point I'm making is, I don't like the dogmatic approach of dismissal. Even if it seems really dumb and superficial and not very, very likely. I don't like absolute statements. To me, it's not likely, or it's very unlikely, or the probabilities are very, 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 very small. What did he say? Oh no, I have been out. So just to be clear, Kip, no, I'm not saying we believe all miracle stories. Don't start that rumor. My goodness, I'll be getting phone calls.
Oh no, I think Kip is worried he's been outed as your friend. I think that's what he's more concerned about.
Okay, I mean, I don't like Kip. Fine, he's a jerk.
Kip's a jerk. And he cheers for a terrible hockey team, so that's all fine.
Well, who does he like?
He cheers for the Flames, I believe.
Oh, well, I'm a Pittsburgh
Flames are the Canucks. He's moved out there. I think he's still the Flames.
I'm a Pittsburgh Penguins fan, and we're in hiding this year. So we're in hiding.
Well, no, but Crosby's having a phenomenal year.
He's the only one. He's the only one.
I know. I've seen them play a couple times.
He's the only one doing it.
Yeah, but for his age,
stellar. He's one of the best.
Yeah,
one of the best.
Chris, most classicists do not think we can reconstruct the teachings or life of Socrates. In fact, It's called the Socratic problem and is considered a failed exercise. See Cambridge Companion to Socrates.
I don't disagree, but I don't think we would deny. But I don't think we just throw all Socrates out either. And I don't think those individuals that he's referring to would say there is no Socrates. We don't know what he said. We don't know what we got. It's just rubbish. I don't think that's the case either. They're not going to be ultimately and completely dismissive.
Okay, well, we reached the end of the super chats, and so I went way over what I told you we would do. So thank you so much for generosity with your time.
Sure.
I will say, we did plug the podcast, but would you like to one more time for everyone listening where they can find you, who you are, all that kind of good stuff?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, one of the things and the key approaches to these situations is there are some that are extremist on things on both ends. I think there is a healthy balance to studying these kinds of things, and we have to put it all on the table. And I see people in your audience and stuff like that. There's good response and interaction. Some people are just completely dismissive and absolutist. I just don't think absolutism works in Christianity. I don't think it works in any realm. I think that we have to always put everything on the table and look at all the evidence. So from my perspective, the Gospels, I think they're eyewitness based. I don't like singularity and putting names on a lot of them. I just don't think that's the best approach. I think there's an asterisk that needs to be put next to them, like I said, because there's so much more to the story that even the church fathers are trying to tell us that we can be dismissive of, that we can absolutely hurt the cause of the Gospels by being too simplistic in the approach of how they came into existence, because there's a lot to unpack. There's problem passages, there's harmonization issues. We cannot just simplistically wave the hand. And so that's my admonition to Christians. My admonition, on the other hand, to those that are skeptical of the Gospels is not to just, again, wave the hand either. Well, that person or that person, well, we don't know much about this. To have an open mind to see and listen. And I appreciate your disposition on that. Like, even be willing to concede at points where, hey, this is plausible. It's okay. Even if you don't land with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or even their communities that were behind it, just be charitable enough to say there's plausible arguments and there's likable arguments within those that defend gospel authorship to eyewitnesses. If you don't think it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or like yourself, Paul, if you don't think it's actually Luke himself, but somebody that was at least trained in medical language, conceding to that is seeing reality for what it is. And I appreciate, the opportunity to hear you even say things like, well, let's, even if I do concede, well, at least you're taking into consideration a thought, I think that's the way to handle this. I personally don't like the bickering back and forth. I've constantly caught myself saying, how many response videos is enough, right? I like these discussions better. Let's clarify, because we realized today that we probably misunderstood each other in a couple of our responses. It is absolutely a necessary thing for us to do in these discussions, is to put it out and say, oh, what I meant was this. I can see why you thought I was going this direction, but what I really meant was this. That's helpful. Now we can move forward, and it saves us another how many hours doing another response video.
That's right.
Just misunderstanding. So, but yeah, that's the only thing I'd really say. I challenge Christians every day to think differently about the Bible, the way that they have been taught. And we're kind of at least doing the same thing on that. And again, my podcast is Facts. We talk about anything church fathers. They're not always this in depth. Sometimes they're just, hey, did you know that we have a story in history about this guy or his claim here and there? Sometimes it's just informative about some of the early church documents or claims that most people don't even know exist. Spend most of my time educating Christians on their Christianity. It's quite funny, actually.
Well, the apocryphal episodes are delicious, even for everyone, I think. So
yeah, I love it. Yeah. There's so many good things out there that just need to be learned. So we're all learning. Man, I'm telling you, 10 years from now, I'm going to look back and say,
that's right.
It's like, it's just none of us have arrived, and the arrogance on both sides is astounding sometimes. But there are some very, very fair scholars on both sides. That's why I appreciate Dr. Ehrman. That's why I appreciate other guys that get in there and just they're fair. They're just fair people, and I appreciate that.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for watching. We appreciate you so much, and we will catch you on another stream probably after Stephen and I do like 8 responses to this or something like that. Later. Bye.